Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video and another instalment of Revisiting, where I look back on one particular album which seems to hold some significance for me, or maybe it's just an album that I'm really fond of. And today we're going to look at another Queen album. So this is A Day at the Races, and I've done a few Queen reviews on this channel. In fact, the second instalment of Revisiting that I did was Queen's News of the World, which is one of the first rock albums, or the first albums really that I ever owned. Bought it in 1977, and that's where I came into the Queen story, really, you know, seeing We Are the Champions and We Will Rock You on Top of the Pops when I was 6 or 7 years old, and that was my ground zero moment for Queen. And that was the album, News of the World was the album where they started to reinvent themselves and turn it more into a kind of radio-friendly pop band, having had this initial run of albums, I suppose, which saw them scaling the heights of, grandeur, pretentious sort of art rock, progressive rock in a way. And A Day at the Races was the album before News of the World. So this, in a way, this album was their kind of line in the sand. And it's often viewed as being sort of one of a pair, really, with the previous album, Night at the Opera. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there's the titles. Night at the Opera and A Day at the Races were both borrowed from a pair of Marx Brothers films, and the presentation of each album was very deliberately designed to be very ornate, that sort of kind of grandiosity coming through in the idea of the crest, the matching crest on each album. They're not quite the same, actually. Freddie did two different drawings, but, they're sort of ornate typography, and the fact that you had this very sort of lavish gatefold presentation with the lyrics on the gatefold each time. Really nice printed inners. You just had a nice foreshot of the band. And I suppose as well, because those two albums fell in the middle of the decade, Night at the Opera was 75 and Day at the Races was 76. So there's all sorts of reasons, I think, why they were historically viewed as this kind of part one, part two. But I do think actually that A Day at the Races is quite different to A Night at the Opera. It's definitely it's not heading into that News of the World territory yet. It's still got one foot very firmly in what you might describe as the art rock camp, camp being the operative word. But the first four Queen albums, Queen 2, Sheer Heart Attack and Night at the Opera, they all had a particular thing happening, really, particularly with Sheer Heart Attack and Night at the Opera, this very diverse, almost kind of scattershot approach where you never quite knew what was going to come next. It's all quite kind of jagged and disconcerting. If you listen to side one of A Night at the Opera, it just, it goes from Death on Two Legs straight into Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon, straight into I'm in Love with My Car, and it's kind of like, where the hell am I with all this? It's just very kind of almost, quite random. And side two of Sheer Heart Attack have been the same. I think with Day at the Races, there was a concerted effort to do something more smooth, really, more streamlined, and maybe just more consistent. The album has a much more consistent sound. There's a run of tracks that have piano as the main instrument. You've got that coming through from the second track on side one is You Take My Breath Away, which is a piano ballad. You've got piano on Millionaire Waltz, on John's song You and I at the end of side one, and then side two starts with Somebody to Love, which is a big kind of gospel piano kind of sound. And I just think this record was them, I think, probably trying to feel their way to a more consistent kind of approach. Maybe it was them realising, really, that if they were going to properly cross over in America and become a huge band, they had to maybe narrow their focus a little bit and, stop being quite so sort of random and disconcerting. But by the same token, they hadn't sort of hit on the kind of new wave sound yet that they were going to get with News of the World. This album, of course, was recorded in 1976, and that really was at the start of the kind of ground zero punk thing. But that music wasn't really going to start coming through properly into the mainstream culture until right at the end of the year. And in fact, I think it was towards the end of '76, wasn't it, that Queen ended up, they pulled out of the Bill Grundy show at the last minute, which was a kind of TV magazine programme, and the Sex Pistols stepped in instead of them, and that was the infamous occasion when, the Pistols turned up on this programme swearing and just being thoroughly disreputable, and in a way that kind of launched punk in a big way, because it was a huge shock to the system, really. It ended Bill Grundy's career. But when this album was being recorded, the punk thing sort of hadn't really happened yet, and my interpretation of what Queen were doing was that they were, on the one hand, they were definitely streamlining and trying to be a bit more cohesive, a bit less stylistically diverse, but they hadn't yet kind of realised where music was heading. The album was recorded over the summer, basically, of '76, with a few more recording sessions heading into the autumn, and I think Queen at that point probably thought that the right thing to do, was to streamline, but also go just even more down that avenue of grandiose arrangements, of overdubbing, just making everything as big as possible, and they'd had that massive hit success with Bohemian Rhapsody in 1975, and I think that is sort of the template for quite a lot of this record, particularly Freddie's song The Millionaire Waltz on side 1, which is a kind of send-up of Gilbert and Sullivan, really, blended in with other things, a bit of Schubert, a bit of Chopin, and then a bit of heavy metal in the middle, a real potpourri of styles in a way. I mean, that song does take the template for Night at the Opera and Sheer Heart Attack, all that kind of strange, diverse genre hopping, but it just does it all in the one song in a kind of really focused way, and then the rest of the album is more consistent. It feels more of a piece. Anyway, not everybody is a fan of this album. I think, like I said, it's kind of seen as being maybe a bit too streamlined, a bit too smooth, a bit too nice in places. I'm really fond of it. It's definitely one of the albums that I listened to growing up. I was probably about 10 years old when I got into it. For me, it was always a game of two halves. I loved side 1, and I wasn't as keen on side 2, and essentially that's kind of stayed the same all through the years, really. I still think this is an album, for me anyway, which is very strong on side 1. Side 2's got some good moments on it, a couple of really good songs actually, but it kind of tails off a little bit. Anyway, let me quickly show you the record before we talk in any more depth about this. So you've got a nice custom label, the credits on that side, the song list on that side, and on this side you've got a really nice colourful label, which again I think was quite similar to what they did on A Night at the Opera, that also had a custom label. So just a couple of facts about this record. It was recorded at 4 different studios. It was done at Advision, Wessex Sound and Psalm East, but it was also recorded at the Manor, which was a big house in the country, essentially. It was a very opulent setting to record an album. I think there were tennis courts there, and it was just, it was a classic kind of mid-1970s place where you would go to record an album if you were a big successful rock band. And Queen holed up there. As I said, they did 2 bouts of recording from July through to August in '76. They did 1 bout of recording, and then they did some live dates. They did a summer tour because they were getting cabin fever in the studio, essentially, and between the dates of the tour they were going back into the studio again to carry on recording, and they carried on recording the album between September and October '76, with mixing in November. They were doing it without Roy Thomas Baker, who was the producer that had steered them through the success of those first 4 albums. He was busy, he was working in America, and in fact he was not to work on the next album either. They also did News of the World without him too. Mike Stone engineered this album along with Gary Langham, and I think Mike Stone was going to go on to do News of the World, and I think Mike Stone became quite instrumental to Queen's career, for a few albums. His sound, he got a really, really nice live sound on this record, a more live sound, I think, than A Night at the Opera, which had a much more kind of aggressively sculpted kind of sonic sound, more like Revolver. It had that really tight, controlled sound. This one, I think, is it's kind of more live. If you listen to the guitar solo on Somebody to Love, you can really hear the sound of the amp in the room. It's an incredibly well mic'd album. You can definitely hear how they've gone to some trouble to just get a really, really nice, big, acoustic kind of environment, and it really does sound tremendous. I think it's one of Queen's best sounding records. A difficult album to make, I think. Queen had reached the point where they were obviously huge. You know, they had this massive success with Bohemian Rhapsody. I'm in Love with My Car by Roger Taylor had been on the B-side of that song, and as a result of that, Freddie and Roger were now stinking rich, and Brian and John were not rich yet. So certain divisions were starting to appear in the band, certain tensions, and I think Brian May said this was a particularly bad album to make in terms of stress in the studio and everybody arguing with each other. It was the beginning, I think, of them. Well, not the beginning, because they'd always done that. They'd always had that kind of tempestuous relationship in the studio, and this album was no exception. There's a photograph taken of Brian May from round about the time of this recording session, and he has a beard in the shot. And, you know, Brian May was never known for having a beard. And somebody asked him, you know, why did you have a beard during the sessions for A Day at the Races? And he just said, I was totally going out of my mind. I was stressed. I was depressed. It was just an awful time in the studio. And I just basically stopped shaving. It's really strange hearing these stories. You know, you imagine these bands like Queen, you know, making these grand opulent statements and having this wonderful kind of lifestyle. But, you know, these albums were difficult to make. This album was difficult to make. It was like pulling teeth. And I think there's no coincidence that the next album, News of the World, they recorded that one really quickly with a much more basic kind of stripped down sound. So, yeah, the album gets off to an amazing start. I think one of the greatest openings to a Queen album. The track is Tie Your Mother Down, which is basically a kind of bluesy rock song, written by Brian May before the band even existed. He wrote the song in the early 1970s when he was still doing his PhD. I think he was in Tenerife at the time, and he'd written it as this kind of bluesy rock shuffle, but, you know, Queen turned it into this huge bombastic rock track, which I think it's a bit of a sort of meat and potatoes Queen song, really, but it always worked well live. I mean, they were still playing it live in 86 on the Magic Tour. You know, it was the second song in the set list on the 86 tour after One Vision, and, you know, it always worked great as a live song. But on the album, it's preceded by this well, the album actually starts with this massive gong crash. I think it's a huge Japanese gong, which was a tribute to their Japanese fans. You know, Queen were huge in Japan. And then there's this incredible passage of orchestrated electric guitars, and Brian May was very clever as usual. He'd been influenced by Escher, the guy that did all the strange geometrically impossible drawings, sort of in the early 20th century. And he was also influenced by this thing called the shepherd tone, which is this thing where you superimpose sine waves in a particular way, and then you have a bass note that keeps rising, and it creates the illusion of this ever ascending scale, sort of similar to what the Beatles did on A Day in the Life, I suppose. And that's how the album starts. Huge gong crash, and then this sort of never-ending, ascending, orchestrated guitar part. It sounds amazing. I think Brian May described it as the never-ending staircase. And the album ends with that as well. It's bookended by this very sort of grandiose, climbing, ascending harmonic structure. It goes into Brian's song, Tie Your Mother Down, which is, you know, I said, is just a bit of a balls-to-the-wall rock song, really. Quite different to anything Queen had done before, I think. They never quite done anything quite so swaggering. They never had that kind of swagger. There was a sort of new confidence to their sound, I think. Going into You Take My Breath Away, absolutely beautiful Freddie ballads with just a gorgeous piano part, you know, very stripped down, sensuous, feminine sounding. You know, Freddie at his absolute classical best, really, sort of elegant and emotional. It is a very emotional album, this, in terms of Freddie's songs. It was a period where I think, you know, he was still, you know, in the closet as far as being gay was concerned. But I think at this point he was sort of teetering on the edge of starting to embrace the gay lifestyle. Wasn't quite there yet, and he was bearing his soul a lot on quite a few of these tracks, and that is definitely one of them. It's just absolutely beautiful. Brian's song Longer Way is just wonderful. It's got a sort of jangling, really lovely jangling guitar. He played a different guitar to his usual one. He didn't play the Red Special. I forget the guitar that he played, but it's got a very different sound to it. And he sings on that track as well. And it's just a song that I always loved. It's very winsome. It's very beautiful sounding. I always loved Brian May's songs. I think he did some really great songs during the 1970s. You know, they had 39 on Night of the Opera, and I think Long Away. Not as distinctive as 39, but I do think it's a beautiful track. The Millionaire Waltz, which I've already talked about, which is this absolutely crazy Gilbert and Sullivan pastiche, very over the top, very flouncy, very outlandish really, with some amazing bass work from John Deacon. There's quite a few passages in the song where it's just piano and John on the bass, and he's playing amazing runs. And Brian as well, actually, on that track, does some really phenomenal guitar playing, orchestrating all these kind of faux classical passages, all with the guitar, something that they'd done on A Night at the Opera, but I think here they really nail it. It's very slick. It's very, very accomplished. You and I at the end of side one, really nice John Deacon song, a kind of power ballad, really. It's got a bit of a McCartney vibe to it. Should have been a single, really. Sung by Freddie, great track. Somebody to Love at the start of side two, one of Freddie's greatest songs. I think completely immortalised by George Michael at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert in the early 90s. An absolutely incredible song, an incredible performance of that song. But Freddie was amazing on it as well. And I guess you could say that song also is a bit of a sort of Bohemian Rhapsody Part 2, just in its scope. It's writ large, huge kind of musical personality coming through there with lots of overdubs, some great drumming from Roger Taylor. And again, this very kind of, these very plaintive lyrics from Freddie. He was often accused of writing whatever, meaningless pap. But there's such a heartfelt theme to this song, can anybody find me somebody to love? Each morning I get up, I die a little, can barely stand on my feet. Take a look in the mirror and cry, Lord, what you're doing to me. I spent all my years believing you, but I just can't get no relief. Lord, somebody, can anybody find me somebody to love? Pure heart on the sleeve, pop poetry really, and just an amazing production, an amazing performance. Choral backing vocals par excellence on that. Then you've got a song called White Man, which is a Brian May song, a bit of a rocker, a bit of a meat and potatoes rocker again, with quite a hard, nasty sound to it. It was never a favourite of mine, really. It's a bit of a political song, actually, surprisingly. Brian could be known to do that kind of thing. It's a song basically about British imperialism or colonialism. White man, don't you see the light behind your blackened skies? You took away sight to blind my simple eyes. White man, our country was green and all our rivers wide. You came with a gun and soon our children died. I think it's a brave song. I think it just never quite convinced me as a Queen song. I always found it a bit dour, really. But I suppose it has its place on the album because the album is quite sort of soft-centred, I suppose. So that, I suppose at least it gives it a bit of a hard edge. Unlike on the next track, Good Old Fashioned Lover Boy, which is, I think it was Freddie Mercury addressing Queen's manager at the time, Elton John's manager as well, John Reid, who was gay, I think. And this one it's kind of like a song from a musical. I've always thought it's a bit of a, again, you could say maybe a bit of a Gilbert and Sullivan kind of moment. It's quite a short song, short and sweet. Lots of overdubbing again, lots of flouncy arrangements, but it's quite nice, it's quite concise. Never been a favourite, it's not a big favourite of mine. It wasn't a single, but I think it came out on an EP, which is how it ended up being on Queen's Greatest Hits. Then you've got an interesting song by Roger, Drowse, which is sung by him, which has got a kind of quite a distinctive slide guitar part. And Roger was usually known for his sort of, hairy-chested leather trouser rocker style songs, but this is different. It's got a kind of hazy late 1960s vibe to it, really. I think the lyric as well was him maybe remembering those carefree days, the pre-fame days, hanging around London, just having a great time with his friends and just having a wonderful time. It has that kind of nostalgic reverie kind of sound to it. It's not a bad song. It's not one of Roger's best. And then the album ends in a song which, again, I've never been that fond of. Tio Toriate, Let Us Cling Together, which is a Brian May song. And again, it was a tribute to the Japanese fans. And it had a Japanese chorus. It just never really gelled with me, really, that one. I always found it a bit too much explicitly a kind of Zippo's Aloft kind of song. Obviously, Queen were very well known for those kind of broad stroke type songs, and that's what they excelled at in a way. But, sometimes those songs, I find them a little bit too too broad, I think, not quite sort of quirky enough or distinctive enough. So as I said, side 1 of the album, that always completely slayed me, and side 2 I was always a bit more ambivalent about. But I think overall, in general, it is a very impressive album. It does divide people. You know, some people think it's a work of genius, other people have no time for it at all. And as I said at the start of the video, it sort of occupies its own space. It's not part of the sort of new wave post-punk Queen, which starts in 1977, and it's not quite part of the lineage of those first 4 albums, which are definitely slightly left field art rock. It sort of has its own place, and maybe in some ways it was a bit of a dead end for them, because once they'd made this album, which is the ultimate, you know, flowery, ornate, cod operatic conceit, really, they couldn't really get that sound to go any further. And sure enough, with the possible exception of Innuendo, which was the last album they did with Freddie, they never really went back to this sound again, really. From 77 onwards, it was the start of a new Queen. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. A Day at the Races, and you can see here I bought it from Boots, and it was the princely sum of £5.70 back in about 1979 or 1980, whatever it was I bought it. Good stuff. Queen, can't be beat.